Today we encounter the story of Caiaphas. We don't hear very much about him. He's often in the background, and the stories and certainly the music is a lot more about Peter and his denial. But he was a very key figure in the first century of the Common Era. Here's a bit of background. He was the longest-serving high priest in the first century, 18 years. 5 of his sons became high priest. His father-in-law Annas was also a high priest, probably with emeritus status by the time he met Jesus. The high priest was also the leader of the Sanhedrin, like the president of the church council, only carrying a lot more weight. Think of the denominational general secretary or the bishop or the pope. But there was during a tense time that Caiaphas served. There was an occupying Roman army, and the Roman governor placed the high priest just to keep things cozy. It's instructive that Pilate and Caiaphas served 10 years together as the main religious and secular leaders of the Hebrew people. You only last that long if you're benefiting Rome and squelching any kind of revolutionary fervor. A religious authority calling revolution blasphemy was a convenient and essential part of the control that the authorities had over the people. As a high priest and chief religious authority in the land, Caiaphas had many important responsibilities, including controlling the temple treasury, the money, managing the temple police and other personnel, performing religious rituals, serving as president of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and the court. But more than that, it was his job to keep the Jewish people in line and to keep the peace. The name Caiaphas means searcher. For what was he searching, I wonder? A solution to the Roman problem? The rebellion problem? To keep at bay religious kooks who would sway the people too much? A way to keep the tenuous peace? Maybe he was searching for legitimacy, just as it quickly slipped through his hands. Caiaphas was in an awful predicament. He had to hold a delicate balance between a brutal secular army and a vulnerable and generally peaceful people. He knew that inflaming one side or the other would upset the precarious balance and possibly doom the people that he was supposed to protect. What to do? Ultimately, he decided that one death was enough of a sacrifice to save the rest of the people. And so he imprisoned Jesus and conspired to give him up as a sacrificial lamb to hold off the wolves of the Roman leaders. All it needed was the word of the high priest. People would believe him. People would follow him. We know from earlier scripture that the decision to have Jesus sacrificed was well planned out. In the 11th chapter of John's Gospel, just after Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, Caiaphas called a council meeting with the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees. John records the minutes of the meeting in the 11th chapter. "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to him, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it's better for us to have one man die for the people and not have the whole nation destroyed." He did not say this on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the children of God who were scattered abroad in the dispersion. So from that day, they plotted to put him to death. How did Caiaphas get there? How did his altruism that was so evident in his early call to the priesthood disappear and he became a bureaucrat, so easily manipulated by the Romans? Actually, he was very well schooled in the art of manipulation. It's the Achilles heel of the clergy. We learn how to make a good argument, sometimes with 3 points and a poem. We learn how to put the fear of God into people, the fear of eternal punishment, the fear of heresy. We know how to lay on the guilt, and we know how to puff ourselves up. This is a dangerous and sometimes lethal combination. There was a time in my life when I was suspicious of my own religious authority. I probably still am. Most of us who go through seminary have this odd conundrum of what to do of this ordination thing that's hanging out there. We know how quickly ordination can go to people's heads. And too often it's used to put barriers between people who love God but choose to make their vocation in different ways, putting the clergy on a higher pedestal than the rest of the people. And knowing that certain groups of people are traditionally denied ordination because of their gender or sexual orientation makes it even more difficult. And that's why I have made the attempt to use my ordination, my religious authority, so to speak words that others maybe can't speak, to be in those places of conflict, to offer a word of hope. Dare we even be so presumptuous to say a word from God? Many of you know that I have a nice blue clerical collar shirt. I only wear it to protests in the state capitol. Those are times when it's important for people to know that there are clergy around, religious authorities who support human rights for all. But what are some of the temptations? Having all the answers, clergy can be tempted by that. Abusing the tax advantage, yes, there is a bit of a tax advantage being clergy. Speaking too much for God and using hubris. Thinking we know what everyone else should do. Shirking the responsibility to advocate for a more just world, for fear that it might just rock the boat too much. These are some of the temptations of the clergy. But here's the thing. Religious authority is not only exercised by religious professionals. All of us here are religious authorities and have religious authority as children of God. And all of us can use our religious authority to do great good, and all of us can abuse it. We can think that we are better than others, especially minority religious beliefs. Just look at the hearings calling Muslims terrorists and radicals, just having creeped up these past few weeks. Jesus was a radical, and yet dominant Christianity is anything but a challenge to the status quo. Martin Luther King famously wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail these following words: "There was a time when the church was very powerful, in the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on, in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven called to obey God rather than humanity. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. Things are different now. So often, the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and even vocal sanctions of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before, says King. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust.